Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Claudio, and thanks very much for the invitation to this fantastic event. And I say fantastic, it's not simply a diplomatic term. It's simply because the art fairs these days is taking over the Biennales, right? Somehow there's a fantastic phenomenon going around the world that 10 years ago was somehow the time for Biennales, and these days you have multiplications of art fairs, and art fairs also adopted in a way a kind of a Biennale model, not only becomes a place to sell artworks, but also somehow take over the role of producing some specific projects, and also trying to be also more intellectual in the way that to organize exhibitions, somehow site-specific, and also conversations like this. And I think this is a very, very interesting phenomenon that I guess, when the Biennale came to a kind of center of the stage of the art world 10 years ago, and nobody would expect that the art fairs would do would play the role which is somehow more than a simple commercial activity. So that said, this transition actually is a fantastic mirroring of what happens in the world, and what is interesting also to see how the biennales, the biennials, can continue to survive, to continue to take the challenge, to provide the new meaning that is unique to itself. I think that's a really interesting challenge for all of us to think about this interesting tension and interaction between diverse forms of promoting artistic and creative ideas and talents. And also how this is, one can also understand that the fact that the art fairs are doing partially things similar to the Biennales, it's also a very good news for us, because that shows the impact of the model of Biennales, the productivity, the intellectual and cultural productivity, the social and even geopolitical influences are actually being seen in this transformation. So I think this interaction is extremely interesting. And today, of course, we have some of the most fantastic people here, and who are doing the most fantastic projects of Biennales related to this region. Hence, a new, not so new anymore, but one of the most significant areas of growth in terms of cultural production, in terms of artistic production, which is the Asia-Pacific region, reaching out to the Middle East. And so also what is interesting is you can see the geographic trajectory of the curators as well, the artists, are so much globalized today. So you have, of course, the local person from Australia, Juliana, Engberg. She is currently the curator of, the artistic director, sorry, of the 19th,
yeah.
Of the Sydney Biennale. And the Sydney Biennale is one of the oldest biennales, I guess, created 40 years ago. Slightly older than most of the people here. Um, and Juliana, the Sydney Biennale has been really famous for its international commitment, bringing contemporary art to Australia. At the time, 40 years ago, was still kind of far west in our imagination. And well, contemporary art landed in that place and somehow produced a great impact on building a contemporary art community because of the Biennale. And so this international interaction has been really effective. And there's been a lot of international curators. And maybe Juliana is one of the few native curators to run the Biennale. And then in the center, Eungie has been an institutional curator for a long time, being curators at the Walker Art Center, the New Museum, and then lately in Brazil. Inuti, sorry. And she's curated a wonderful Biennale of the New Museum, a triennial, no? Triennial. A couple years ago, before she moved to Brazil, and now she actually becomes globally nomad, engaging with the Sharjah Biennale. And the Sharjah Biennale, it's at its 20-something years, right?
Yeah, it started in 1992. Oh.
Yeah.
Started in 1992, so yeah. It's the 12th edition is next year.
The 12th edition. So Sharjah, as you know, is situated in another far east in our imagination until quite recently. How the Biennale actually has another particular role in preparing the ground for the arrival of contemporary art in that region. It's also it's also a phenomenon which is again very, very important. And then next to her, there's Jessica Morgan. She's the curator of the Tate Modern, and being another institutional curator engaging with a Biennale. And it's supposed to be the first Biennale that Jessica is working on, and it's the Gwangju Biennale in Korea. And that's all I think here people, we are more familiar with the Gwangju Biennale because it's closer to us. It also has about 20 years of existence from 1997. 95, sorry, I keep making mistakes. And after all these years, my first question to the panel is, what do you see the new challenge for each of these biennales who have kind of common role in making creating a new scene in the respective areas, and on the other hand, being put into this new challenge of globalization when biennales are facing various kind of questions. Number one, its own maturity. Number two is, as what I described in the beginning, that art and business, art and our markets kind of, entering to quite interactive and sometimes kind of loaded kind of interaction. And what's your new vision? Maybe we start with Juliana.
Wow, that's quite a large question. Well, I suppose, the Sydney Biennale being 40 years old has, I think, already had a very various history. It started off as a very, very localised kind of event and actually was drawn strongly from a particular locality, which was then transposed to Sydney and then enlarged to, I think, essentially create a dialogue between Australia and Europe. And certainly in its first few iterations, that was evident, I think, from the work that was done. But because it's had a 40-year history, it's gone through many permutations, it's lived inside an institution, it's found itself out in places that were discoveries in the urban scape. It more recently added an island to its mixture of spaces. So it's evolved and it's grown, I think, you know, substantially. I think also because it has sought the artistic direction of many different kinds of curators drawn from a variety of places, it has always had an opportunity to reinvigorate itself, to reinvent itself, and to establish a set of dialects, I think, that are quite interesting. So before me, I think we had a strong focus upon indigeneity, say, with Catherine and Gerald's installation. Before that, we had a very nice, fanciful, boisterous kind of presentation from David Elliott that took a kind of colonial, post-colonial kind of proposition with a baroquerie around it, you might describe. Before that, we had the very carefully drawn historical referencing of Karol and Krzysztof Bakaviev. Before that, Charles Merriweather took us in a direction that was, you know, quite political and geopolitical in a sense, and in the territory of South America and some of those places. So each time it changes, and I suppose that's the wonderful thing about the Biennale format. It tends to change and evolve as you have a different artistic direction, you have a different kind of language that comes with each person who does it. And each of them, I think, and certainly from my point of view, you look back at the most recent iterations that have been before you, and you try to manoeuvre yourself in such a way as you're not replicating that. So you're adding to that set of episodes. For me, I decided because the indigeneity, the post-colonial, the historical had been done, I would go to some other destinations that had not been overworked in the last few years. So Scandinavia, the emerging eastern countries of Europe, to Asia, to America and so forth, and of course Australia itself. And in particular, I think it was an opportunity for me to look at some of the urban indigenous artists, less the artists who come from the more traditional making, to place them in centre place with their peers. So how that answers your question in terms of what comes for the future of the Sydney Biennale, every time will be different, and undoubtedly I think models will be investigated, territories will be examined for their usefulness and the way in which the audience also can fruitfully engage with those places. So there's work still to be done. I mean, it's to me, the Biennale is a wonderful format. It's I mean, it's a very fantastic place to develop something from a curatorial point of view, and from an audience point of view, I think it is an especially vivid encounter, different from, say, an art fair, which is, you know, purposefully commercial. This is not, and so you can play with ideas and you can create explorations, itineraries, and you can be involved, I think, with aesthetics and tell stories through those things. So for me, I think it's a wonderfully vivid sort of thing to be engaged with. What it will become for the next one, that will be somebody else's issue.
I think in your introduction, Hanru, you were talking a little bit about how the Biennale format was like the in format 10 years ago. But, you know, as we know, one of the great objectives or results or motivations of participating in working in the Biennale format had to do with building infrastructure in our so-called regions. And that job is now complete, as you know. So I think this is really important to think about how the biennial has evolved in certain regions, maybe where there's more established biennial foundations, and how even those foundations are now working together to make a biennial foundation, right? Mm-hmm. So all these biennials are also involved in a foundation called the Biennial Foundation at this point.
Not Sydney, though.
Not Sydney,
no,
okay.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Yeah. But I think it's an interesting...
It's a kind of global alliance of biennials these days.
It's an alliance of biennials. I hate this word global, and I think, you know, globalization is a term for the market, so it's okay for art fairs, but it's not okay for biennials. I think we have to think more about the microcosmic and the macrocosmic and what's been developed, what's been established, and what we're after in the future, or in the present, rather. In Sharjah, the biennial has been ongoing continuously since 1992, and in the 22 years since, there have been interesting developments, and of course, 1992 is only 21 years after the formation of the United Arab Emirates. So this is a very young country, and one of the third largest emirate in the country, and one with a leader that is specifically devoted to culture. So, I mean, this is an important context. So during the development of the Sharjah Biennial, the local expanded itself. So the microcosmic became a macrocosmic. And I think in 2002, the president of the foundation, Hur al-Qasimi, went to Okwin Wazir's Documenta 11, was it? And asked the question, why isn't, the Sharjah Biennial truly international? Why is it international but only regionally international? And so she came back, quite young, an artist, and involved herself in the National Biennial and has been working there ever since to fully internationalize the biennial so that these larger questions around, the development of contemporary art for the region, in the region, and the discursive possibilities, could be fully explored. And this is why we started this, this mess, or why we involved ourselves perhaps in this mess in the first place. So I think it's important to think that in Sharjah they went from having a biennial to having, with under the leadership of Jack Persekian and Hur al-Qasimi, they developed a foundation. And this foundation is year-round. They took biennial programs like residency and commission programs and separated them so that while there are residencies and commissions within the biennial, there are also separate residency and commission program opportunities for artists from the region, but also internationally. And then finally, they built new spaces. So I think, to go from having a museum and an expo center to some old heritage buildings, and then to continue to expand, both the level of discourse, provided by the biennial, but also the spaces for, that are appropriate to the goals, to develop these over time is a really interesting project. And I think in that way, it responds to, why the biennial might still be relevant or how it could differentiate itself as a unique venue or format.
Interesting. I think I wanted to respond a bit to what you were saying at the beginning about this collision of market and biennials, because I think we really need to enforce the differentiation, of which there are many, but I think probably the key ones are, of course, concept. An art fair doesn't have a concept. I think every biennial that's worth its salt does, and it's an incredibly important, often very political aspect of the work of the curator. But there's also the sort of question of context and duration. An art fair is 3 or 4 days, and a biennial is probably months, and the impact on the context in which it takes place and which it's made for, very deliberately thought through and constructed and responding to its context, is probably the most important element, as Eungie's described so eloquently, the sort of role it plays in actually developing an infrastructure of the arts, a legacy, a continuing program of events. I know that Sharjah isn't only a sort of one-off event, it's something that actually spreads into the duration of the years that it's not evident as an exhibition. So I think this role of a presence, of a sort of curatorial and conceptual and constructive, productive presence is really key to keep in mind as a very absolute definition from an art fair. Gwangju has a very particular history. I'm sure many of you know its reason for the founding of the Biennale is in fact to commemorate an event that took place in Gwangju in 1980, related to the uprising, which was a democratic uprising of the people of Gwangju against what was then the military dictatorship. So it also makes for a very specific context to work in. In fact, as a curator, I think it almost couldn't be better. You have a very politicized, but also a very historically overburdened almost context to deal with. And of course, it's been the subject of almost every Biennale to some extent or another. It's almost impossible to ignore the fact that the reason for the Biennale's existence is to commemorate the events of the deaths that took place in 1980. But of course, the question is how to continue to make this relevant to a contemporary perspective, to perhaps look at the way in which those events relate to also a more historic trajectory of Korean history, which is itself a very violent and a very complex one. So I think the placement of this specific history in Gwangju can be looked at in a much broader historical perspective, and has been by many of the curators who've taken on the previous editions. Alia Swastika is here, who was one of the curators from last year. And I think the challenge is really, yes, how to sort of, on the one hand, evoke this memory, which is, of course, important to honor and to think about, but how to think about how this may, in fact, be almost irrelevant for some of the younger population of Gwangju, which is the primary audience of the Biennale. And I think this is another sort of key differentiation, perhaps, with Gwangju, although I think it's also similar to Sharjah, perhaps, which is the audience is, massively dependent or taken from not only Korea, but also Gwangju. It's visited by hundreds of thousands, but they're people who are from the Korean peninsula. And so the exhibition really needs to be for the people of Korea, not for an international audience, I would say. So how to articulate something, as Juliana was describing, that is a new perspective, that's not a repetition of previous editions, but also how to articulate something that's actually speaking to a particular condition in Korea at this time. Of course, a huge challenge coming from the outside and not being familiar with the context. But I think just as Eungie was describing, this sort of development of the Biennale is not simply the one-off event. In the case of Gwangju, of course, there's also a design Biennale that takes place on the alternate years to the art Biennale. There's a curatorial school that takes place in the summer. There's a art magazine, a journal that's published on a biannual basis. So there's a sort of larger presence, I suppose, that's important to be understood as what the sort of overall role of the Biennale is. And indeed, Dr. Young-Woo Lee, the foundation director, has now established the Biennale Foundation. So there's a kind of network as well, international network of biennales. I think the other thing that's quite remarkable perhaps about Gwangju is the year it was founded, 1995, as the so-called Year of the Arts in Korea, only 6 years after the end of the military dictatorship, and a sort of celebration and also an affirmation that the arts were going to play an important role in the development of Korea. And the Biennale has remarkably kept a very sort of agile presence, I would say. I mean, looking back at the curators who've been invited, it's had a very different character. Of course, you were one of them, every year. Whereas I think many of the institutions that were established at that time have not had the same flexibility and have perhaps suffered from a kind of bureaucratic stagnation even. So I think to witness the sort of potential of the Biennale as an invigorator within a particular country, no matter what the context is, whether it's Korea or Australia or even the UK, that the Biennale offers a kind of intrusion, subversion, interruption of what might be the status quo of the arts organization of that particular location, which is an important example to offer on a sort of institutional level, let's say.
Yeah. You mentioned that the importance of the concept, right? How, in your particular project, what kind of concept you are? It's time to talk about that maybe before the press conference. You've done the press conference, by the way, yeah. So no secret anymore. So how do you respond to all this contextual questions that you just mentioned with your concept?
So the title of the exhibition is Burning Down the House. Yeah. I think probably, as most curators do, I listen to the artists that I've been working with, particularly in Korea. So what was going on, or what I was hearing from a lot of people, had very much to do with the contemporary political landscape and with the changes that have taken place, perhaps particularly in the last few years. And some key individuals, particular artists, I think, who are taking a longer historical approach and looking at perhaps, I suppose part of the idea of burning down the house is also the, on the one hand, advantage of perhaps burning down the past, leaving things behind and being able to move forward, which is definitely a characteristic of Korean economic development, we could say. Also characteristic of other parts of Asia. But of course, there's a huge amount that you leave behind in this process of burning down the house, so to speak. You leave behind, of course, any kind of interrogation of what may have happened, which perhaps potentially could repeat itself if it's not fully examined and discussed. And I think a lot of the artists that I was drawn to and interested in were taking on this type of, not necessarily, I mean, historical investigation makes it sound very much like a sort of archival project, but actually much more of a present interrogation of what is happening at the moment in Korea, but how that might in fact link to past events and past histories.
Eungie, your concept?
I am before the press conference.
Just before. So a little bit secret.
Yeah, well, yeah, you get to learn something that no one else knows, I guess. But Jessica's Biennial is opening September 4th?
Fourth. Yeah.
And Juliana's
I'm nearly closed.
When did you open? March?
March, yes.
So I opened March 2015, so you'll excuse me if the concept is bumpy at best. But you know, I like that Jessica mentioned that, of course, you have to listen to the artists that you're working with, and you know, and what's relevant at a certain time, or what's, you know, of course, as curators, we respond to what we perceive as the urgent. And I have been working with some groups of artists over the last, I would say, 10 or 15 years, who have gotten me trying to articulate something that has to do with many of the ideas you were just commenting upon. And but most importantly, you know, why continue to use, you know, the question keeps coming, why is contemporary art relevant? How can it be relevant to us? You know, not to speak entirely against the fair, but, you know, in this time of great compromise due to the commercialization and the monetization of our practices, you know, how do we move beyond that? How do we say that, you know, without this commercial enterprise, you know, what are we after? I think we're really asking these kinds of questions. So the title of the 12th Sharjah Biennial is The Past, the Present, the Possible. And it comes from an article called The Right to the City by Henri Lefebvre. And I think a lot of our concepts are quite similar, actually. So I don't feel the burden to go too far into it, but I think there are two main issues here. One is, one has to do about locating ourselves in the present and stepping away from a kind of apathy or state of being overwhelmed. You know, so I think a lot of the artists that I really admire are artists who, given in the face of extreme economic violence, what Edouard Glissant would actually call economic terrorism that we're living in right now, that can still try to open avenues for us to reconsider possibilities or avenues of thinking that could possibly open something else up. So this is something very important in the concept that's coming. And the other is the idea of time, you know, to really examine the idea of time and the simultaneity of time, which is something that, you know, I've been working on with my colleague Dorian Chung, who's coming in very late, who's off time. But
come to the front.
Yeah, right here. But this idea of the simultaneity of time, about how, you know, we're increasingly bringing together different communities. It goes back to what I was saying about the microcosmic and the macrocosmic. But we're bringing together different groups of people. And maybe in my community, things happen very quickly and we think about history in one way. And maybe in your community, things happen very slowly and you think about things in another way. And I think we have to, you know, respect these differences, live next to each other, let them coexist, but not change entirely logic of these different systems of time. So that's something else that I'm trying to address within the biennial.
And the scale?
The scale? Meaning?
Meaning the scope of the exhibition, how many artists?
I can't
it's
tell
not
you
by
that.
now.
I don't know yet. Normally. I guess the Sharjah Biennial has traditionally had somewhere, I mean, in the last 10 years, 12 years, has had somewhere between probably 75 and 120 artists. And we're trying to keep, trying to keep that to somewhere around under 60.
That's very ambitious.
Well, it has to do with the way of working, I mean, which is also something that I've been trying to examine in my own practice as a curator. You know, something that we did for the March meeting, which is an annual meeting that was developed by the Sharjah Biennial, was to bring together artists to use the March meeting as a unique to kind of think about how it's a unique discursive platform and to use it as the departure point for the biennial. So to bring people together and bring artists into discussion with each other and the public from the outset of our thinking. And during that time, I mentioned a lot in this kind of, you know, very sappy way that I have, that, you know, I do think it's time that we take the responsibility that we recognize and really try to develop a way of working and an art world that we want and that we deserve. So, you know, like we have to quit bitching about other people's, you know, problems or limitations of this and that and the other and how, you know, we're compromised and really just focus on what we are able to do.
Yeah, I think this is pretty ambitious in the sense that all the biennales are now wanting, not all, but quite a lot, wanting to be as bigger than the others, even. And there's some interesting kind of competition around this, you know, the size of things, the numbers of things, and just like the art fairs. I mean, the art fairs are not like Basel now has, I don't know, 3 different sites, and probably it's going to expand to, you know, and one day maybe the Sharjah Biennale would have branches around the world. I don't know, but let's hope not. But
I don't think so.
But this is an interesting desire. This also comes to the concept of Juliana's Biennale. It's about desire. I think. If I didn't misunderstand it.
No, I mean, it's open for interpretation. I mean, that's the whole point of it, really, in certain ways. But if I can just pick up on these threads, my ambition, you know, really was to make a very slow Biennale. And, you know, this is a good context in which to speak about that, because I do feel that there is a sort of frenzy around the art world. And these exciting events like art fairs build into that frenzy, this... you know, you come swiftly to a place like this, you absorb a lot of things, you go away, what does it mean? Because you have time, the luxury of time with a Biennale, and you have a hopeful sense that there will be opportunities for repeated visits, especially from those people who are your local catchment, and they form the vast majority of an audience for something like the Sydney Biennale. You can actually play with time, and you can create multiple itineraries that they can perhaps investigate, you know, over that period of time, and that you give them peaks of experience in the middle, at the end, as I've proposed to do, which provides new information that they can then revisit things with. So I used time as a strategy, and I used slowness as a very deliberate methodology, in as much as, you know, I want to slow people down. I actually I don't expect that anyone will sit there and really watch David Klarbutz's, you know, Quiet Shore for a whole 2-hour sequence, but it would be certainly lovely if they would take the time to maybe spend 15 or 20 minutes with such a thing, just to give themselves a kind of, you know, refreshing, regenerative kind of opportunity. And I think that's what I was trying to do. And the other thing I was trying to do was to reignite, to some extent, the concepts of imagination that is embedded in the artistic process. for both the artist and for the audience. I believe the audience comes looking for engagements with imagination. They want to see activity. They also want to participate in that in a variety of different ways, not just necessarily passively, but also sometimes actively. So of course I also wanted to involve actual bodies in the production of energy, and I made a number of projects like that. And I also was responding strongly to each of the venues that I have at my disposal. Some of them are institutional spaces, some of them are wild, you know, feral kinds of spaces like the island. And so imagination and desire comes into play in a variety of kinds of ways. And because the audience is a very general audience in Sydney, it's not necessarily a cognoscenti audience, I think you need to deliver that on a range of platforms, a range of entry points as well. I had a lovely email last night from somebody who took their mother through, who was 85, and they said to me, you know, she feels re-energised by just encountering a lot of these things. And, you know, for me that's actually enough. You know, that somebody has come with their mother who is very old and who, you know, has lost a certain vitality and then feels more vital again. That's an incredibly important thing. But that they've spent 3 or 4 days doing so is also very important to me, and that they've imbibed an experience that's actually, you know, gone into them in some sorts of ways. So, you know, Sydney for me was a very hyper-visual experience. I wanted to produce an event that actually reacquaints us with a kind of aesthetic and visuality, and do it in a range of ways that, you know, encountered the anthropological, the psychological, the surreal, the energetic, the anarchy. Sorry, did you ask me a question? What was the question you asked me, Hanru?
Not really a question, I guess.
What was my
everything is a question.
What was my theme? I didn't have a theme. I had an evocation, but, you know, my comms people said I wasn't allowed to use that word because nobody would understand it. And, you know, really?
It's no longer about remote beauty, right? Or the beauty of being remote. What was the title?
No, I mean, that was
David?
That was David's shtick, which I thought was rather beautiful, actually. You know, he turned the tyranny of distance into the beauty of distance. And it is very true that Australia is still very distant from many places, even from here. And so that does give us, I think, license to still gather many things. It's less of a localised context. It's still, I think, a quite international context that we wish to produce. Because many of the people in Australia will not have the opportunity to go and see so much. And so it is a great opportunity to actually bring that extra quality group of works together.
But when I was in New Zealand working on the Auckland Triangle...
Yeah, which was very nice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Australia seems to be, especially Sydney, seems to be the center of the world.
But you see, I'm from Melbourne, you can't say that to me. No. No, Sydney, of course, is fantastically international, and it's a wonderful, feral, wild, demonstrative kind of environment in which to work. But actually, if I'm being truthful and not just parochial for a moment, I would say that Melbourne has a highly vital network of ground-up spaces, and probably is still the engine room of local production. Sydney is really taking it up to Melbourne at the moment, and the introduction of several new spaces such as Carriage Works makes it, you know, a very, very big sort of delivery quite recently. Yeah,
actually, talking about that, in fact, what I was really thinking is how much a Biennale can continue to play a role in connecting this more local conditions and what things, Eungie hates the word global, but you know, things coming from outside or people from coming outside, and how to generate a singular condition for artistic productions and maybe social productions as well. Through the Biennale projects. And this is perhaps the fundamental reason of why we continue to have so many different Biennales in different parts of the world. And it continues to generate a new kind of difference, indeed. It's not simply we want to be looking like Venice, right? I think we are all very conscious about this importance of keeping the diversity. And in practice, it's not that simple, I guess. It's always, one of the interesting contradictions is when you are a local artist, you really want it to be recognized internationally. A lot of people work for that. How to be international is also a very contradictory question. Do I need to produce things looking like Jeff Koons, or to take a better example, looking like Murakami, or things like that?
I mean, you know, it's an interesting question because I think it's extremely hard if you're from, say, Australia and your idiom is maybe the monochrome to gain any kind of real international traction. And I think that that's true of many artists, actually. The thing that is attractive to a curator mostly, unless you're actually making a show about the monochrome and you want to show its variants, you know, across the world, is that you're actually looking for that accent. You know, and a Finnish artist is a completely different, you know, creature to, say, an American artist. They come with their own history and they come with their own specificity. They come with, if they're Finnish, lugubriousness, as compared to, you know, an American who might have a much more vivacious pop culture kind of approach. And these are the things that actually makes it really exciting to look at the international events, because you are actually seeing those dialects, you're seeing that accent. It's harder to see that if, in fact, people work within the context of, say, very canonical deliveries, such as, you know, modernism, neo-geo, or things of this sort, because they're rather similar. The accents are not as clear. And that's, I think, you know, why people say there's a certain Biennale type of artist, but actually I think it's more to do with the fact that, you know, we're seeking that different accent. We want to actually understand that. And we find it very exciting when we find something uniquely different.
And I would add to that I think, you know, by juxtaposing them in the biennial, you know, whereas we know that in our institutional practices, it can be very difficult. The Tate's, you know, starting to be an exception here, where many institutions don't have a mandate. You know, they really tried to serve something that's not exactly local, but it can't be overly international, no? Mm-hmm. Because people start getting nervous. So I think in that way, you know, the biennial format has also allowed for unique opportunities of juxtaposition, and therefore, you know, the reconsiderations of what exactly, what are the art histories that are maybe untold, and what kinds of things happen simultaneously that were relevant. So, you know, it makes you think about, you know, kind of quiver in the world, right? So I think that in that way, you know, we still have something quite lucky to explore there in the biennial.
And it's maybe also a voice of affirmation for artists locally as well, that perhaps not highlighting, you know, I think one of the problems that certainly I've perceived in Korea specifically is that so many, particularly the female students, study abroad, US or the UK, and yeah, there's a certain sort of international language that's picked up, and in fact, in general, the work is much more interesting when it's not part of this sort of attempt to enter into a sort of non-Korea specific conversation, and that perhaps encouraging a kind of confidence in a voice that is not speaking specifically to this sort of unknown universal art scene would also be important. And I think Eungie's right in saying that it's about precisely creating these dialogues between different aspects, which are perhaps not the expected ones to appear. But
yeah, this actually brings us to another question: is because of this interaction between local and global and so on, and trying to be kind of new local indeed. It's trying to be particular and so on, might generate different ways of curating and different ways of producing art as well. for example, the idea of bringing artists to do residency, to work on site-specific projects. This is kind of classical approach. And besides that, how curatorially you'd also try to connect the project with maybe a larger social context, and including education, including communication, including working with people who are not directly involved with the Biennale and so on. And what's your experience, and it's a part of your curatorial concern, or?
I think here I would have to admit that there's a frustration of language, and that my potential is limited by that severely, which I think is an issue in that particular arena in Gwangju. I know that there's a huge amount of educational activities that take place during the during the period of the Biennale, and you know, much as I would like to be involved, I know that I'm limited by my incapacity to speak Korean. So I think, you know, one can be involved in terms of encouraging and orchestrating and bringing it about, but I think it's something that could be developed more there, I would say, definitely. I think it's not a priority in the way that it could and should be. And I think back to this question of the relationship between a locality and a specific place. I mean, I've spent a lot of time meeting with artists and the sort of general art scene in Gwangju, and of course there is a feeling of you know, the sort of alien being that arrives every 2 years and has very little to do with their own environment and the sort of activities that take place in Gwangju on a sort of longer term. So certainly we've made an effort to try and bring this kind of conversation into certainly the thinking behind the Biennale. But it is very hard, I think, when you're not embedded in a place. I'm sure Juliana has a very different perspective, knowing so well the context you're working in.
Yes, although, you know, Sydney being so distant from many places, it's actually, it would be hard in such a short time frame to really organise so much of that between the event. I think if you're doing a documenta, or if you're doing maybe even a triennial, you have just that little bit of luxury of time ahead of your event where you can build those things in. What I did was I tried to do it inside the event. So with the front program, the middle program and the end program, recognising that there would be 3 different opportunities for those kinds of... That's worked really well, you know, and we're finding that people are coming back, you know, in the middle, and they're planning to come back at the end. But to be truthful, in 12 months of making the exhibition, it would be, you'd be going flat trap. And you don't have a, you know, I don't know what your budget is like, but the budget of the Biennale of Sydney is not huge. And so that is also, you know, problematic, you know, to try and arrange those sorts of things. I mean, it was highly admirable, you know, the work that Carolyn did with Documenta, preparing the way for all of those things, but she has a 5-year span, and it makes sense that you can sort of do that. But it's, I mean, really, it's a baton race. You're handing it on to the next. I mean, it's a very fast thing, a Biennale, actually.
Very fast.
Yeah, I think, in fact, for certainly coming from an institutional perspective...
Having said that, though, Jessica, I mean, you know, it would be good. I mean, you're right in as much as you're not from there, and so it's harder. If I had a time again, and knowing what I now know about the pace of this particular Biennale, it would be possible to talk with some of the colleague spaces to get them to actually generate something in between. And that would actually be a really good thing to do, and maybe something the Biennale of Sydney could think about in the future. It's not so much that, you know, one would curate it so much as one would invite the other institutions to make and take that opportunity, which I think would be good. We did have a big visiting program, which was great, supported by the Australia Council, which has been, you know, fantastic.
I mean, I would say in the case of Sharjah, there's 2 important factors. One is that, you know, the country's small. The Emirates is small and it's vast, physically vast. And so if not for the great efforts of the commercial enterprises, the galleries and the art fair in Dubai, if the museum activities that are developing in Abu Dhabi, you know, if these things didn't come together, with Sharjah's own local audience and then, you know, the other Emirates, if these things didn't come together, there would be no local audience. You know, so it's an audience that's becoming increasingly more sophisticated, the local audience. And then there's also a so-called, you know, local-ish audience, which is, you know, in the so-called region, which extends all the way to the Levant. So that's not actually that close, but you know, if you compare like the distance, you know, the distances are greater, but you have to go out a bit to start to even come to the same population as Korea. So, that said, the Sharjah Art Foundation, one of the reasons that I'm working with them is that I really admire that they've had a really strong hand in providing funding for the production of art from the region. There's been a commitment to this that was really clear. You know, it has been really clear, I would say, for the last, I think many of us have benefited from this, you know, in works that we've presented probably since the mid-2000s. So, so the education or the interaction with the public is kind of going both ways. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, you know, there have been varying levels of intensity of the relationships between the universities and the foundation. And I think an ongoing attempt, but certainly the education activities of the foundation itself, because they're working year round, you know, are quite improved from, you know, 10 years ago. And it's something that I did, you know, that has been a focus of my own practice in the past. And so it is something that I'm trying to propose, you know, certain kinds of things to engage with local audiences and try to expand the local audience through a certain approach to the film programs and a certain approach to monthly talks, like ongoing series that maybe didn't occur before, to also help, I mean, not to sound, I don't mean to sound patronizing, but to help the foundation, you know, to help them understand what they can actually establish there, because there are certain kinds of, I would say, you know, around institutions everywhere, there are misunderstandings of what education departments can do. You know, where the curatorial and the educational meet, and I think they have to be much more. It has to be a much more dynamic relationship, and much more polluted. And so I think, you know, that's something that I would try to demonstrate in general.
Yeah. Let's go to another totally different question. From time to time, again, a Biennale, as you said, it's a little bit like a UFO indeed, coming from somewhere else. Contemporary art, by definition, it's a UFO in the society, right? If it's no longer UFO, it's no longer something that brings the unknown to us, it's no longer interesting. In general, by definition, art, it's something that opens up a window towards the unknown. But we are also facing an interesting reality that, on the one hand, art becomes increasingly popular, increasingly integrated into the everyday consumption of the middle class, the educated class, the creative class. Is what they say, right? And on the other hand, how to continue to preserve certain kind of critical dimension to that. This somehow generates from time to time some confrontation, some conflict, some incidents, even some scandals. We all love that. One of the latest controversial incident was with the Sydney Biennial. Well, some artists protest against the funding structure, basically, that the public institution, the foundation, the Biennale is somehow have to accept certain domination of the financial power in a way, or at least, you know, in the imagination of some artists, and this new mechanism somehow, you know, brings us back to the beginning of this discussion, is about the market force and art. Maybe Juliana, you can give us some, not only some anecdotic stories about that, also some insights.
How long do we have? To be precise, it wasn't the funding structure that the artists were concerned with. One of our founding sponsor, or our founding partner, which is a company called Transfield. It's quite tenuous, but just bear with me. Transfield were about to sign a contract to provide services to the government in support of their detention centres offshore. However, our chairperson, who oversees a group called Transfield Holdings, is different from Transfield Services. But there was a link between our chairperson and Transfield Services through a small number of shares that he held. Not insignificant, but a reasonably small number. The protest, of course, was directed at essentially, I think, really the policy itself, which was a policy that is much talked about in Australia, is very disagreed about in Australia also. There are people on both sides. And the artist, I believe, felt that this was a platform for bringing attention to that policy. It got a little bit misguided and it got a weeny bit misdirected, to be truthful. The calling on the artist to boycott the event was, I felt, not overall helpful to the idea of bringing attention to the policy issues. It started to camouflage that, and it started to steer a conversation toward funding and relationships that may prove difficult, in the future for the event. But certainly it brought into focus, I think, the fact that artists are not docile. They are not necessarily just prepared to be owned in any particular way by anything. And that goes, I think, to your point. Actually, this will always keep the context critical. This will always keep the thing vital, because essentially you are with your artists, you are with your primary producers, and their opinions, are important, and their opinions should be heard. So for the Biennale of Sydney, I think this was the most historical set of conversations. I suspect they will be ongoing for some period of time, and they may have some impact on conversations that take place elsewhere also. It did bring, the patron world into collision with the creative world a little bit, and it was interesting for me to actually be witness to some of the conversations that took place, many of whom were somewhat misdirected and misinformed as well. And it was difficult times. It sucked a lot of energy away from the first few weeks of the Biennale event, actually, and I felt that the artists felt tremendously burdened by that, and I did what I could to try and help each and every one of them, those that wanted to remain in and those that chose to go. Of course, eventually everybody stayed in Bar 2 once the decision had been taken by the chair to remove himself. I view Luca as a victim, in a sense, of a set of circumstances that were extremely complicated. But it is important, I think, for the Biennale to examine its whole structure, its sponsor relationships, and I would say that it sends a message to most of us, involved in events that have support, sponsorships, etc., to have a substantial risk assessment around what we do. There will be certain things that are simply intolerable for artists to deal with, and we need to be alert to that. We actually need to work toward, a situation that is, acceptable and fair, too.
Can I ask you a question, Eungie? I was wondering, just hearing Juliana talk about this, if you've had any response from the artists in relation to issues of censorship or what can and can't be done within the context of Sharjah. Another history with a...
You're not going to make me tell this story. First, can I just respond to something that you said? But I do think that the actions, and I understand everything you're saying, and especially this issue of the burden to the artists that came about the complicatedness.
I think it was a huge burden for them.
But I do think that it brought a lot of attention to the issue, because I didn't know about the issue.
But what issue did you think was being addressed?
The issue of the detention center.
Do you really?
Yes,
well,
because that's what I learned. I learned about the detention center, and I learned about the policy. And so then if we think as, actors in society, as, that the art community could demonstrate an example of you know, your citizenship and, you know, the value of your voice. I think it's a huge success. But that said, I also understand that, you know, Hanru thought it was about a funding structure.
Yes.
So it's complicated.
From a distance, it's difficult for people to get to grips.
There were some very responsible journalists who spelled it out quite well.
Mostly the international people, actually.
I think it was more, not art. It's not art writing that clarified it to me.
That's right.
You know,
that's
it was more international news,
Yes.
or maybe even Australian news, but it was
a
more traditional news source,
yes,
not art
right.
news.
That's right.
So in that
but I'm
regard,
glad if that's the case.
I really read and learned about it, and it sent me on a little thing to learn more about what was going on there. So
it's an important
I think, you know, then if you think about that in relation to similar issues that we're having around detention and deportation in other countries.
It's a global issue.
It's a huge issue.
It's a massive issue for everybody.
You know, so I think let's think of the positive.
Yeah. No, well, you know, I did, and that's,
I know,
and that's why, essentially, whilst it was difficult, I would never criticise any of the artists for taking a stand and making their position felt, even though perhaps some people wanted me to.
Sure.
And I simply could not put myself in that position. I remained in support of each and every one of them, because that was important for me, that they understood, even if they had to make that decision, that I could support them in that decision. It's a hard thing for an artist to decide, especially if they've invested, you know, 12, 14 months in doing something.
And just like we know that all biennials are not the same, all curators are not the same, and all artists are not the same.
No.
You know, and these issues of politics or perspectives on, you know, the economy and whatnot are, you know, uniquely our own.
Well, Fulia was very kind in saying, you know, it will bring a lot of attention to your event.
Okay.
Are we out of time? Or do I have to answer
we're
this
almost, but, you know, this conversation can help, could happen in the room behind if without the public, right? So it's time for us to turn to the public.
Saved by the bell.
Some questions?
Saved.
Anyone has some urgent questions, or not that urgent questions, but all questions are welcome. We have another 15 minutes. Wait.
You spoke about the biennial in contrast to the art fair and having a space for non-commercialized art or less commercialized art. And I wonder if you see in the future the biennial creating new space for artists that don't have commercial recognition, or do you think it will continue to, that you can't escape sort of the current art market and the art fair and the fact that sort of international recognition is also dependent on your commercial success?
I think, sorry if I can speak up, I think biennials are often actually a great place for showing artists without commercial representation. I can't speak for my colleagues, but I'm sure you're showing artists who are not represented. Certainly, again, back to a Korea-specific context, I think the majority of the artists that I'm showing from Korea are not represented by galleries. It's almost 20% of the exhibition. So, in fact, I think it's not, that's not a, you know, it's already happening, let's say.
And I think we weren't necessarily speaking specifically of commercially viable art versus non-commercially viable art. I don't think that distinction is very tricky, but I think it's what's determined by the commercial market, which is, you know, unique. I mean, for the most part, it's object-based, right? It's got to be something you can sell. So then you get into, you know, gray areas that are a little bit complicated. But I think, of course, you know, if you look at some of the images that my colleagues have provided, because I have not.
And I'm sorry, there's a lot
like
of
this. Can you sell
you
this?
see a lot of activity or action-based works that, I mean, how do you categorize that in relation to an object, you know, that could be monetized in any way? So, you know, we have to have these spaces for things that happen through time and through space, maybe over months, you know, that grow like moss to the stone. So I think this is one of the unique things that biennials try to do, but institutions do better.
Yeah, maybe. But I think, you know, it's also that, you know, I think most of the artists with representation are under immense pressure now to produce work for the market, which is ever expanding as Hanru was saying. So the opportunity to make work, I've been amazed at the response of artists that I've invited to be part of the Biennale. I think partly because they feel released from the constraints that are otherwise very much a pressure in their role within a market structure.
Yeah, it might change what you think an artist does to see what they produce
Yeah.
under different conditions than the more recognized institutions.
Thank you.
More questions? Yeah.
This was a very important question of Jessica Morgan about the political situation, because as a curator, would you say no to, if somebody offers you to curate the Kiev Biennial in the Ukraine, would you say no, I can't do it? And there is another UFO landed in Rome, this is the MAXXI. So it's not only the Biennial, which is a UFO, the MAXXI is a wonderful concept. It's a landed UFO on Earth. So, but
No, I'm happy to address this. I don't really want to get into the censorship issue because it's way more complicated than can be addressed here. But personally, I would only do a biennial that I wanted to do, just like I would only take a job that I wanted to do. And in that, I would say that matches, you know, the kind of mission of my own practice, you know, so that has to do with decisions of, you know, just curiosity, like what's interesting to be working on, but also issues of your ethics, you know, your personal ethics. So the Sharjah Art Foundation is a very unique foundation. I can't stress enough, and if you talk to people about its president, Hura Hassami, you'll hear amazing things because she's really a visionary. This is why I'm working on the Sharjah Biennial. There are other biennials who have asked me in the past to, you know, propose something, and I have said no many times because I'm not a mercenary biennial curator, and if Jessica's doing her first biennial, I guarantee you she's not either.
Exactly.
She would begin to be.
Plus, life is too short to have a job and do biennials and, you know, and
Well,
live. So you have to be selective.
now, it's not the place to talk about the MAXXI, but just one word to say. Number one, actually, the MAXXI, it's not such a UFO in the sense that there was nothing else. There's nothing else before, and there's a continuation, an interesting story, and not only in terms of the art community, and also in terms of the urban evolution of the city, of Rome, of this country, and so on. But that's another long story. But what I'm saying that being a UFO, meaning it's not simply you have a building which is not a replica of a Roman arena, but it's much more about the activities inside. This UFO is not simply, I think, like the Biennales. I think it's more about bringing something that seemingly unknown, seemingly unfamiliar, but indeed it's fundamentally important for the people living there. So that kind of a relationship should be really articulated through a form which is somehow strange.
Yeah, and to some extent, to pick up on the gentleman's question, you know, I think we tend to work with hope, and you know, in terms of the Ukraine, we are hopeful. I'm sure all of us that, you know, their situation becomes tolerable better, and you know, sometimes art can have a role to play in creating an environment that provides discussion and new opportunities and experiences. And so I think, you know, one should never be cynical about that. One should always examine it on a case-by-case basis and, you know, not necessarily shy away from what might be difficult, but is actually very essential and potentially very helpful as well. So, you know, I mean, it's not an easy question to answer because it's very complicated, any kind of environment like that.
I think there's some really crucial question here is the historical dimension of all the events, including how we talk about Kiev, how we talk about Ukraine these days. I think we simply often in the media, in the public imagination, we simply erase the historical reason why this happened. I guess, you know, arts or a biennial or whatever art events has the vocation somehow to bring us to look into this historical backgrounds through a particular language, which is often provocative. And I think that dimension has to be really preserved and made visible. So this is why art, by definition, is a UFO in that sense. We have another 8 minutes.
Hi, Juliana. Just with the Sydney Biennale and the funding issue, you mentioned that could cause problems for future events. How do you think there is a way to get around that, given corporate sponsorship and even government sponsorship is linked to policies that artists may protest against or react to?
Sorry, second part again?
How is there any way around that to avoid those conflicts, given...
No, I think it's entirely complex. And... you know, I'm speculating that it will be difficult. That will be something for the Biennale organisation to deal with. You know, I mean, certainly this has, I think, been a very testing time for this organisation, and they will undoubtedly be, you know, doing their reviews of their own situation, and they will be actually looking to create an environment of stability for that event. But it's opened up a question that will not go away now, and that is that some sponsorship, some support will seem to be intolerable to some artists. And so, as I said, I think before, I think that's something that all of us, all the organisations that we work with, including my own at ACCA in Melbourne, we will need to be alert to those things. I mean, it's a normal part of business, I think, to run risk assessments anyway, and this one becomes, you know, one that should be placed high on the agenda. Reputational damage by association. I mean, at ACCA we've always rated that pretty high. I think, you know, this will need to become part of the conversation ongoing for all organisations, including the Biennale of Sydney. But look, you know, Sydney is very blessed with, I think, a marvellously generous patron base. I mean, beyond sponsorships, there are a huge number of people who care very much for that event. It's a central plank within the cultural delivery of that city. It puts in $61 million worth of investment into that city, you know, by its ripple effect. So I think it's unlikely that we'll see the demise of the event, but it may have to be reformulated, reshaped, and that won't be a bad thing for the event at all. I mean, that is part of the evolution of an event, and it's always been evolving for its 40 years. Once started in Mildura, wound up in Sydney, was small, now big. Who knows what kind of shape it will be. So these things are opportunities. I always see these things as opportunities, actually. It keeps it vital, and it keeps it on its, you know, toes.
Juliana, sorry, can I ask another question? You staged a Biennale in Melbourne 15 years ago, which I still rank as one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. It was supposed to be something that would continue on.
Yes, we now call it the one ennial. The one ennial.
Why is it that you think that Melbourne hasn't been able to have a regular Biennale, given that, as you say, it is the engine room of the arts in Australia?
What should have happened, actually, is that Melbourne ought to have created something more like a manifesto, because Melbourne is where the grassroots activity takes place a lot, and that would have been a viable turnabout event, I suspect. But in a country like Australia, I think you're probably naive to imagine that you can have two Biennales. You know, I mean, we do have two. We've got the Adelaide one, which is a more localised event, but from an international point of view, requiring the assistance and the support of many international funding bodies, etc., it's hard, I think, to present two. Melbourne, I agree with you, the Melbourne International Biennial, one ennial as we now call it, was a fantastic event. What it did produce was, I think, a situation in Melbourne which grew ACCA, and we certainly got, I think, a wonderful Kunsthalle as a result of that. It grew a number of other desires and interpretations that, you know, didn't become that event. It consolidated itself through, for many years, the Melbourne Festival, in which I did, you know, some outstanding programs as well. It whetted the appetite for international contemporary art in Melbourne in a way that I think was absolutely fabulous. But, you know, it was what it was. It was a one-ennial.
So
Yes.
I'm going to address Jessica's question because I feel like I strayed.
Yes.
I'm not going to address the issue of censorship in terms of the larger context. You'll have to see me off mic for that. But no, I don't feel limited because I think whenever we do projects, maybe we know our home audiences the best, our home publics the best. But I mean, I think all of us as curators that are located somewhere try to be respectful of the local public. And I think because the local public in Sharjah has, you know, certain, something that people call conservative, although I wouldn't necessarily call it conservative, but you know, there's a way, there's modesty issues, there's all these kinds of issues at play that I think, you know, when you're in a place and you hang out there, they start to be quite natural, no?
Mm.
I mean, so you don't understand the language in Gwangju, but there's something of the pace of the way people are and the way they dress, and you know, that starts to communicate some of the values of people. And I think it's quite easy from that point, you know, if you're paying attention, it's quite easy to.
No, I was
if you're not trying to provoke in a certain kind of way.
Yeah. I was wondering whether any of the artists had raised it with you as a question, or you know, that their participation was.
I do think, you know, there is this larger issue. I mean, if you're not familiar, there's these larger issues that have happened with the Sharjah Biennial 10, you know, kind of scandal there, and, you know, an ongoing boycott going on in Abu Dhabi. And so there are many kinds of issues going on that are pretty complex. Yes, I mean, people have asked me offline, you know, are there contradictions in this? Da, 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 da. I think these are really complex issues, you know, and so we have to have, you know, big conversations, you know, sometimes that fall into almost like existential conversations about these, which are really necessary, which, you know, then you remember how lucky we are to be in the kind of work we're in, that it forces us to ask these questions, to address them, to not be able to be so judgmental of somebody else once you realize that you can't answer this question or something like this. So I think in that regard, it's a complex situation, but it's not an unproductive situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, last question for the last minute. So let's thank the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.